Hello guys, welcome back to Boring Historian. Tonight we are pulling back the richly embroidered, yet often rather heavy, curtains on one of history's most formidable and long-lasting empires. We're setting our weary sights on the Ottoman Empire, a realm that stretched across continents, commanded vast armies, and boasted a culture of dazzling complexity. But beneath the glittering domes of Istanbul and the seemingly unshakable power of the Padishah, life for many, as you might guess from our theme, wasn't always a delightful stroll through a rose garden scented with Turkish delight. What you're about to hear might stick with you. We're going to explore some of the reasons why, for many of its inhabitants, life in the Ottoman Empire could, well, suck. If you're picking up what I'm putting down, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. And as always, please do drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the globe. It's always wonderful to connect with our far-flung fellowship of history aficionados. All right, find your quiet space, let the outside world fade, and let's begin our journey. Imagine yourself for a moment, not in your comfortable 21st century surroundings, but somewhere within the sprawling domains of the Ottoman Sultan, perhaps in bustling Constantinople or Istanbul, as it would come to be more widely known, sometime in the 16th or 17th century during the empire's zenith. Or maybe you're in a dusty Anatolian village, a sun-baked Balkan town, or a wind-swept North African port. The specific location might vary, but one overarching reality would dominate your existence, casting a long, often chilling shadow over every aspect of your life. The absolute, unassailable, and frequently terrifying power of the Sultan. You, whether a humble peasant, a striving artisan, devout scholar, or even a high-ranking official, exist entirely at his whim, your fortunes, your property, your very life, hanging by the silken, yet incredibly strong thread of his imperial will. The Ottoman Sultan was no mere king or president bound by constitutions or pesky parliamentary debates. He was, in the grandiloquent language of his court, the shadow of God on earth, Zalullah-i-Alamdar, the caliph of the Muslims, at least from the early 16th century onwards. When the Ottomans claimed this spiritual leadership of Sunni Islam, the Padishah, great king or emperor, a ruler whose authority was theoretically absolute, derived directly from divine sanction, and maintained by a formidable military machine and a complex bureaucratic apparatus. His word was law. His decrees, or firmans, issued from the opulent splendor of the Topkapi Palace, could change the course of empire, levy new taxes, declare wars, order executions, or elevate a humble servant to dizzying heights of power, all with the stroke of a calligraphic pen or a whispered command to his Grand Vizier. It's like living in a world where the CEO of everything can rewrite the terms of service for your entire existence on a daily basis without notice and with no appeals process. Good luck complaining to customer service about that. This concept of absolute power is a difficult one for us, steeped as we are in ideas of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, to fully grasp. But for you, as an Ottoman subject, it was the fundamental reality. There were no elections, no free press to critique the Sultan's actions, no independent judiciary in the modern sense that could truly challenge his authority. While Islamic law, Sharia, and established custom or Qanun provided a framework, and learned religious scholars, the ulama, could offer interpretations and advice, the Sultan was generally considered to be above the law, or at least its ultimate interpreter and enforcer. His person was sacred, his decisions unchallengeable. To even contemplate treason, let alone to act upon it, was to invite the most horrific and exemplary punishments imaginable. A mainstream historical fact for you. The Ottoman Sultan's titles were numerous and incredibly grandiose, often including phrases like Lord of the Two Lands and the Two Seas, Sovereign of the House of Osman, Sultan of Sultans, Khan of Khans, Commander of the Faithful and Successor of a Faithful, and Successor, the Prophet of the Lord of the Universe, just to give you a small taste. It's a business card that would require its own scroll, and probably a small boy to carry it. This absolute power was not just an abstract concept. It had very real, very personal implications for everyone in the empire. The character, the whims, the health, even the fleeting moods of the individual sultan could have a profound and often unpredictable impact on the lives of millions. A wise, just, and energetic sultan might preside over a period of stability, prosperity, and relatively fair administration. His decrees might promote trade, build magnificent mosques and public works, and ensure that justice, at least in theory, was accessible to his subjects. You might, under such a ruler, feel a sense of security, a pride in the empire's strength, a belief that your own small life was part of a grand and divinely favored order. But what if the sultan was cruel, capricious, or simply incompetent? What if he was a paranoid recluse, easily swayed by ambitious factions within his own palace, or a decadent libertine more interested in the pleasures of the harem than the governance of his vast domains? Then life could become a terrifying lottery. Decrees might be issued on a whim, with little regard for their consequences. Taxes could be raised to ruinous levels to fund lavish new palaces or ill-conceived military adventures. Officials who displeased the sultan or who were denounced by a rival could be dismissed, disgraced, exiled, or executed with terrifying speed, their property confiscated, their families ruined. The fear of arbitrary power, of a sudden, inexplicable turn of fortune, would be a constant undercurrent to your existence. It's like living with a landlord who is also a god, and who has very strong, very changeable opinions on interior decoration, and whose preferred method of redecorating involves summary evictions and the occasional public impalement. Even if you were far removed from the glittering, treacherous world of the imperial court in Constantinople, you were not immune to the sultan's shadow. His authority was projected throughout the empire by a network of governors, pashas or beys, judges, cadets, and other officials, all appointed by and answerable to him. These men, in theory, were supposed to administer justice, collect taxes, and maintain order according to the sultan's laws and the principles of Sharia. But in practice, with vast distances separating them from the central authority, and with the ever-present temptation of corruption, many of these provincial officials could become petty tyrants in their own right, enriching themselves at the expense of the local population, secure in the knowledge that an appeal to the sultan was a difficult, costly, and often dangerous undertaking. You might find yourself at the mercy of a local qadi who demands a hefty bribe to rule in your favor in a property dispute, or a provincial governor who imposes illegal taxes to line his own pockets, all while professing undying loyalty to the Padishah in far-off Istanbul. Complaining too loudly could get you branded a troublemaker or worse. "It's the ultimate," he said. She said. "Only he has an army, and you have a donkey, and a strong sense of injustice, likely to get you flogged." The precariousness of life extended even to the highest echelons of Ottoman society. The Grand Vizier, the Sultan's chief minister, was the second most powerful man in the empire, wielding immense authority. Yet his position was entirely dependent on the Sultan's favor. A single misstep, a lost battle, a whispered accusation from a rival in the harem, and he could be dismissed, stripped of his wealth, and executed, often by the symbolic silken cord. A bloodless execution deemed appropriate for high officials. Many grand viziers met such an end. Their ornate palaces, their vast fortunes, their armies of retainers all could vanish overnight. A stark reminder that no one, however powerful, was truly secure under the Sultan's absolute rule. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you. It's said that when a new Grand Vizier was appointed, he would often keep his affairs in meticulous order and his will constantly updated, as he never knew when his predecessor's fate might become his own. It's like being promoted to CEO of a company where the previous 5 CEOs were all unexpectedly retired via a trapdoor in the boardroom. Makes you think twice about accepting that corner office. This constant insecurity This knowledge that your life and livelihood could be upended by a distant, often unseen, and entirely unaccountable power was a fundamental reason why life could indeed suck in the Ottoman Empire. It bred an atmosphere of caution, of sycophancy, of looking over your shoulder. You learn to keep your opinions to yourself, to avoid drawing attention, to navigate the complex currents of local power with a mixture of deference and cunning. Freedom of speech, as we understand it, was a dangerous fantasy. Criticizing the Sultan or his policies, even in private, could lead to ruin if your words reached the wrong ears. The empire had an extensive network of spies and informants, and the walls, as they say, often had ears, and sometimes those ears reported directly to someone with a very sharp scimitar and a distinct lack of patience. Consider the impact on something as simple as your property. While Islamic law recognized private property rights, the Sultan was ultimately considered the owner of all land in the empire. He could grant land, and he could, and sometimes did, take it away. If your farm or your workshop happened to be in the way of a new imperial mosque, a palace extension, or a strategically important road, it could be expropriated, perhaps with some nominal compensation, perhaps not. If you were a wealthy merchant and the Sultan's treasury was running low, perhaps due to an expensive war or an extravagant new harem wing, you might find yourself subject to a contribution or a forced loan that you had no hope of ever seeing repaid, or your entire estate could be confiscated if you fell afoul of a powerful official or were suspected of some crime, real or imagined. This lack of secure property rights, this constant threat of arbitrary confiscation, acted as a dampener on long-term investment and economic initiative for many. Why bother to build up a prosperous business if it could all be taken away on a whim? It's like playing Monopoly, where the banker can just decide to seize all your little greenhouses because he fancies building a new hotel on your Mayfair. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Sultan's power was truly absolute in practice. Some scholars emphasize the formal theoretical basis of his autocracy and the lack of institutional checks and balances. Others point to the very real constraints imposed by Islamic law Sharia, which even the Sultan was expected to uphold, at least publicly. The influence of powerful groups within the empire, like the Janissaries, the elite slave soldier corps, or the ulama, the religious legal scholars, the sheer vastness of the empire, which made direct control over distant provinces difficult, and the importance of custom and tradition. It's likely that the reality was a complex interplay of these factors. A wise sultan understood the limits of his power, the need to maintain the support of key elites, and the dangers of alienating his population too severely. But the potential for arbitrary and absolute action was always there, a sword of Damocles hanging over the head of every subject, from the highest vizier to the humblest goat herder. And it is this potential, this ever-present possibility of unconstrained power being wielded against you, that could make life feel so precarious, so terrifyingly uncertain. Imagine you're a skilled artisan in Istanbul, a master craftsman renowned for your beautiful tile work. One day, you receive a summons. The Sultan requires your services for his magnificent new mosque. This could be a great honor, a chance to create a lasting masterpiece, to earn imperial favor. But it could also mean years of your life dedicated to this one project, perhaps with little or inadequate pay, your own business neglected, your family struggling. And what if your work, despite your best efforts, fails to please the Padishah or some influential courtier? The line between imperial patronage and indentured servitude could be perilously thin. The Sultan's whim, which could elevate you, could just as easily crush you. This constant awareness of your utter dependence on the favor of a single, all-powerful individual. This knowledge that your talents, your property, your very life were not truly your own, is perhaps the most profound reason why, for many, the shadows of the Sultan could indeed make life suck. It's a world where the ultimate lottery winner is the one who manages to live a quiet, unnoticed life, far from the dangerous, dazzling, and often deadly orbit of absolute power. You're beginning to feel it, aren't you? That cold, unsettling tremor of understanding that comes from living under the shadow of the Sultan's absolute whim, where your life, your property, your very sense of security can be overturned by a distant decree or the caprice of a powerful official. Remember that feeling, that constant, low hum of anxiety beneath the surface of everyday existence? Well, for certain communities within the vast Ottoman Empire, this general unease could crystallize into a very specific, very personal, and utterly devastating terror, the devshirme or child levy. Imagine you are a Christian peasant, perhaps a Serb, a Greek, a Bulgarian, living in a small Balkan village nestled in some remote mountain valley. You work the land, you pay your taxes, of which we'll speak more later. Don't you worry, you raise your family, and you try to live a quiet life under the often heavy hand of Ottoman rule. And then one day, the imperial officials arrive, not for your grain or your silver, but for your sons. This, my friend, is the devshirme's dread, a cruel harvest of youth that fed the empire's insatiable military and administrative machine, and a prime example of why, for many, life under the Ottoman Star and Crescent could truly, profoundly suck. The devshirme system was a unique, and for those subjected to it, a deeply traumatic institution. Essentially, it was a periodic levy of male children from the Christian peasant populations of the Balkans, and, to a lesser extent, Anatolia. These boys, typically ranging in age from around 8 to 18, though sometimes younger or slightly older, were forcibly taken from their families, transported to the heart of the empire, converted to Islam, and rigorously trained to serve the Ed Sultan, either as elite soldiers in the formidable Janissary Corps or as officials in the palace administration. A mainstream historical fact for you. The devshirme began in the late 14th or early 15th century and continued, with varying intensity and frequency, for several centuries, providing the Ottoman state with a corps of highly trained, fiercely loyal and entirely dependent servants whose primary allegiance was to the Sultan alone, untainted by regional loyalties or powerful provincial families. It was, from the Ottoman perspective, a brutally effective method of state building and military recruitment. From the perspective of the families whose children were taken, it was an unmitigated tragedy, a wound that often never healed. Picture the scene. Your village is a small, close-knit community, life revolving around the agricultural seasons, the local church, the familiar bonds of kinship. Rumors might precede their arrival, whispers carried on the wind from other villages that have already endured the levy. The Sultan's men are coming. A palpable sense of dread descends. Doors are bolted earlier. Children are kept close. Prayers are offered with a new, desperate fervor. And then they arrive. A detachment of Ottoman officials, perhaps accompanied by a Janissary escort, their unfamiliar uniforms and stern demeanor, an immediate symbol of the empire's implacable power. They carry the Sultan's firman, the imperial decree authorizing the levy. There is no arguing, no appeal. Your village has been selected, and a quota of boys must be met. The selection process itself is a chilling affair. The officials might gather all the eligible boys of the village in the central square, or go from house to house. They are looking for the brightest, the strongest, the most handsome. Physical health and intelligence are key criteria. A boy who is too small, too sickly, or deemed dull-witted might be rejected, a small, bittersweet mercy for his parents. But if your son is robust, quick-witted, with an alert and pleasing appearance, he is a prime candidate. Imagine standing there helpless as these strangers scrutinize your child, your heart, a cold stone in your chest. They might ask him a few questions, test his agility, inspect his teeth, as if he were a prize colt. There's a cold, impersonal efficiency to it that is utterly terrifying. They are not seeing your beloved son, the boy you've raised, a unique individual with his own nascent dreams and personality. They are seeing raw material, a potential janissary, a future cog in the imperial machine, and then the moment of separation. If your son is chosen, The grief is immediate, overwhelming, and utterly public. Mothers wail, fathers clench their fists in impotent rage, siblings cling to their departing brother, but resistance is futile and often dangerous. The officials are armed, backed by the full authority of the Sultan. Any attempt to hide a child or to actively resist the levy could result in severe punishment for the entire village. So with tears streaming down your face, with a last desperate embrace, you watch your son, little more than a child, being led away, part of a bewildered, terrified column of boys, their familiar world snatched from them. Their future and unimaginable blank. They might be given a small payment, a token sum for the losses of their child. But what comfort is a handful of silver coins when a part of your soul has just been torn away? It's the kind of grief that settles deep in the bones, a sorrow that colors every sunrise, every harvest for years to come. You might never see him again, or if you do years later, he might be a stranger, a powerful janissary perhaps, speaking a different language, worshipping a different god. His childhood memories of your village buried deep beneath layers of indoctrination and military discipline. It's a living bereavement. The journey for these young levies is long and arduous, a brutal introduction to their new lives. They are marched, often for weeks, across rugged terrain towards Istanbul or other training centers. They are far from home, surrounded by strangers. Their only companions are the equally terrified boys. The conditions are harsh. Food might be scarce, shelter rudimentary. Discipline is strict. Any sign of rebellion or despair is swiftly and often brutally suppressed. This journey itself is part of the seasoning process, designed to break their spirit, to sever their ties to their past, to begin the transformation from Balkan peasant boy to loyal servant of the Sultan. Upon arrival at the training centers, the process of assimilation begins in earnest. The boys are formally converted to Islam. While the Quran technically forbids forced conversion, the reality of the devshirm was that conversion was an integral and non-negotiable part of the system. They are given new Muslim names. They are taught the Turkish language, the customs of Ottoman society, and the tenets of their new faith. They are circumcised. Their previous identities, their family names, their native tongues, their childhood faith, are systematically erased, or at least deeply buried. It's a profound cultural and psychological uprooting, a deliberate remaking of the self. Historians still debate the extent to which these young men truly internalized their new identities and faith, or whether some retained a hidden sense of their origins. But outwardly, at least, they were expected to become loyal, unquestioning Muslims, their devotion directed solely towards the Sultan and the Ottoman state. The training itself is relentless and rigorous. Those destined for the Janissary Corps, the Assemi-Olan's novice boys, undergo years of harsh military discipline. They learn to use weapons, the bow, the sword, and later, firearms. They engage in endless drills, physical conditioning, and mock battles. They are taught obedience, endurance, and a fanatical loyalty to their corps and to the Sultan. Life in the Janissary barracks is communal, austere, and entirely focused on creating a perfect fighting machine. There are no family ties, no outside allegiances to distract them. The Janissaries are, in effect, the Sultan's slave soldiers, bound to him by a combination of indoctrination, privilege. They were often well paid, held a high status within the military, and the knowledge that they had no other life. Family to return to. It's like a very extreme lifelong military boarding school where the graduation ceremony involves being issued a very large musket and sent to the front lines. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you: to ensure the loyalty and cohesion of the Janissary Corps, its members were, for a long period, forbidden to marry or engage in trade. Their entire lives were to be dedicated to the Sultan's service. This, of course, changed over time, and later janissaries did marry and accumulate wealth, which some historians argue contributed to the decline in their military effectiveness and their increasing interference in politics. But in its early idealized form, the janissary was supposed to be a man set apart, a warrior monk whose only bride was war, whose only family was his regiment. You can imagine the HR department having a tough time with that particular clause in the employment contract. Benefits include regular meals, a pointy hat, and absolutely no romantic entanglements ever. Sign here. Those boys deemed more intellectually gifted, or perhaps more physically prepossessing, might be selected for service in the palace schools, such as the Enderun School within the Topkapi Palace. Here, they would receive a sophisticated education in Islamic theology, law, literature, languages, music, and the arts of administration, preparing them for careers as high-ranking officials, governors, or even grand viziers. This path could lead to immense power and wealth. Indeed, many of the most influential figures in Ottoman history, including several grand viziers, rose from the ranks of the devshirm. From the Ottoman state's perspective, this was the genius of the system. It took bright, capable boys from potentially restive subject populations, severed their local loyalties, and transformed them into an elite class of administrators and military leaders whose success was entirely dependent on, and therefore dedicated to, the Sultan. But what was the price of this opportunity? For every devshirm boy who rose to prominence, there were thousands who remained anonymous soldiers or minor officials, their lives spent in harsh discipline and dangerous service. And for all of them, regardless of their ultimate station, there was the initial trauma of forcible separation from their families, the loss of their native culture, language, and religion, the psychological impact of being molded into instruments of beings, an empire that had, in a very real sense, enslaved them. It's a dark irony. The chance to achieve power and status within the empire came at the cost of your freedom, your identity, and your connection to your own people. It's the ultimate Faustian bargain, struck not by you, but for you, when you were too young to understand the terms of the contract. For the families left behind in those Balkan villages, the devshirme was a recurring nightmare, a source of profound and lasting grief. The levy did not happen every year, or in every village, but its possibility was a constant shadow. Some families resorted to desperate measures to try and save their sons. They might try to hide them when the officials came, though this was risky. They might try to bribe the officials, though this was often futile, and could lead to even worse repercussions. Some even resorted to marrying off their sons at a very young age, as married men were sometimes exempt. Or, in a truly heartbreaking act of desperation, some might even mutilate their sons slightly, hoping that a physical imperfection would make them unsuitable for the levy. These acts speak volumes about the terror the devshirme inspire. The thought of your child, raised in your faith, speaking your language, suddenly being transformed into a janissary, a soldier of the very empire that ruled over you. Perhaps one day even being sent to fight against his own people. It's a prospect too horrific for many of us to truly comprehend. The devshirme system, therefore, stands as one of the starkest examples of why life under Ottoman rule could be particularly brutal for certain segments of its population. It was a systematic, state-sponsored violation of the most fundamental human bond, that between parent and child, all in the name of imperial security and expansion. While it undoubtedly contributed to the strength and stability of the Ottoman state for centuries, it did so at an immeasurable human cost, a cost paid in the tears of countless families and the stolen childhoods of generations of Balkan boys. The dread of that knock on the door, the arrival of those stern-faced officials, the sight of your son being led away, That was a unique and terrible burden carried by many Christian subjects of the shadow of God on earth. You felt the icy grip of dread, haven't you, as we imagined the arrival of the Sultan's officials for the Devshirme, that cruel levy of young boys destined for the Janissary Corps or the palace schools. That particular horror, the tearing away of children from their families, was a unique and deeply traumatic burden for many Christian communities in the Balkans. But even if your family was spared that specific agony, perhaps because you were Muslim, or lived in a region not subject to the levy, or simply because fate, in its inscrutable way, passed over your household this time, there was another universal and relentlessly grinding pressure that defined life for the vast majority of the Ottoman Sultan's subjects, especially the peasantry, the ever-present, often crippling, and seemingly endless burden of taxation. The empire, with its vast armies, its opulent court, its sprawling bureaucracy, and its constant military campaigns, had an insatiable appetite for revenue. And you, our humble farmer, artisan, or herder, were the primary source of that revenue. Prepare yourself for a journey into the world of Ottoman tax collection, a realm where the only certainty was that the taxman cometh, and he cometh often, leaving many to feel they were truly taxed to tears. Their endless toil serving largely to fill coffers far removed from their own meager existence. Imagine yourself as Mehmet, a peasant farmer in Anatolia, or perhaps Dragana, a villager in Serbia, tilling your small plot of land from before sunrise to well after sunset. Your life is one of relentless physical labor, governed by the seasons, the whims of the weather, and the hope for a decent harvest that will see your family through the harsh winter. You coax life from the soil with your own sweat and calloused hands, your back aching, your future dependent on the caprice of rain and sun. And then, after all that toil, after you've carefully gathered your meager crop of wheat or barley or olives, comes the tax collector. He is not a friendly neighborhood accountant offering helpful advice on how to maximize your deductions. He is an agent of the state, or often an agent of the state, and his arrival is rarely a cause for celebration. It's more like that sinking feeling you get when you see a parking ticket on your windshield, only instead of a fine, it's a significant chunk of your entire year's livelihood. And instead of a parking warden, it's a stern-faced man who might have a parking warden, couple of armed guards with him, just to encourage prompt and cheerful payment. The Ottoman tax system was a complex and multifaceted beast, a patchwork of different levies that had evolved over centuries, drawing on Islamic legal traditions, pre-Ottoman Byzantine and Balkan practices, and the pragmatic needs of a sprawling empire. For you, the peasant, the most significant and often most burdensome tax was likely the ushur or ushur, the tithe on agricultural produce, a mainstream historical fact for you. The ushur, in theory, was supposed to be 1/10 of your harvest, a religiously sanctioned tax based on Islamic principles. However, in practice, the actual percentage collected could vary significantly depending on the region, the fertility of the land, the specific crop, and, crucially, the demands and honesty, or lack thereof, of the local officials or tax farmers. It could be as high as a third, a half, or even more in some cases, leaving you with barely enough to feed your own family and save seed for the next planting season. Imagine carefully tending your olive grove all year, praying for a good crop, and then having to hand over half of your precious oil, the fruit of your labor, knowing it will likely enrich someone far removed from your daily struggle. It's enough to make you want to take up interpretive dance, despite your father's earlier disapproval. But the ushur was just the beginning of your fiscal woes. If you were a non-Muslim subject, a dhimmi, and we'll delve deeper into the dhimmi experience in a later section, you were also liable for the jizya, a poll tax levied specifically on adult, able-bodied, non-Muslim males. This tax was, in theory, in exchange for exemption from military service, which was largely the preserve of Muslims, particularly the Janissaries, and for the state's protection. However, for the peasant struggling to make ends meet, it was another significant financial burden, another drain on already scarce resources. The amount could vary, and its collection could be harsh and humiliating. Failure to pay the jizya could result in severe penalties, including imprisonment or forced labor. It was a constant reminder of your second-class status within the empire, a tax on your very identity. And then there were the avarice taxes. Oh, the avarice. These were originally extraordinary or emergency levies, imposed during times of war, which in the Ottoman Empire was a rather frequent occurrence or other crises, to cover exceptional state expenditures. Think of them as the Ottoman equivalent of a surprise special assessment from your condo board, only instead of fixing the leaky roof in the common room, is funding a new fleet of galleys to go and bother the Venetians, or perhaps to purchase a particularly shiny new set of jewel-encrusted turban ornaments for the Sultan. The problem with avarice taxes was that these extraordinary levies had a nasty habit of becoming regular, permanent additions to your tax bill, even when the original emergency had long since passed. So, you might find yourself paying a tax originally levied to fund a campaign against the Persians a century ago, alongside a newer one for the latest Cretan adventure, and another for the upkeep of a distant fortress you've never even heard of. It's like having a subscription service you can't cancel for a product you never wanted, that just keeps adding new, increasingly expensive features. The list of potential taxes didn't end there. There were taxes on livestock, the anam resmi, taxes on mills, taxes on beehives, taxes on mines, taxes on markets and trade, tolls on roads and bridges, taxes on marriage, taxes on inheritance, fees for various official services. It could feel like every aspect of your life, every transaction, every milestone, came with its own associated fee, payable to the imperial treasury or its designated agents. The sheer multiplicity of these taxes, and the often unpredictable way in which they were assessed and collected, could be a source of constant anxiety and confusion. You needed to be a part-time accountant just to keep track of what you owed, to whom, and when, all while trying to, not starve. Perhaps one of the most pernicious aspects of the Ottoman tax system, and a major reason why it often sucked for the common person, was the prevalence of tax farming, known as iltism. Instead of the state employing its own officials to collect taxes directly, which was costly and administratively complex for such a vast empire, the right to collect certain taxes in a particular district for a specified period would be sold off to the highest bidder. This successful bidder, the tax farmer or multazim, would pay a lump sum to the state treasury and then recoup that amount, plus a hefty profit for himself, by collecting the taxes from the local population. While this system provided the state with a guaranteed upfront revenue stream, it was often disastrous for the taxpayers. The multazim, having paid a large sum for his contract, was under immense pressure to extract as much as possible from the populace, often far exceeding the legally stipulated rates. He was, in essence, a private contractor whose profit margin depended directly on how effectively he could squeeze the peasants. It's like letting a fox guard the henhouse, if the fox had also paid a substantial franchise fee for the privilege, and was extremely motivated to maximize his chicken acquisition. These tax farmers and their agents could be notoriously corrupt and ruthless. They might use false weights and measures when assessing the US share on your crops. They might demand payment in cash when you only had produce, forcing you to sell your goods at a disadvantageous price. They might invent new unofficial fees and charges. They might use intimidation, threats, or even outright violence to extract payment. Complaining about a rapacious tax farmer was difficult and dangerous. He was often a powerful local figure, perhaps with connections to higher officials, or with his own band of armed retainers. An appeal to a Qadi judge might be met with a deaf ear if the Qadi himself was in league with the tax farmer, or if he had been suitably bribed. For you, the peasant, the arrival of the multazim or his men was often a moment of profound dread, a prelude to arguments, threats, and the bitter realization that yet another significant portion of your hard-won livelihood was about to disappear into someone else's pocket. Historians still debate the overall economic efficiency and social impact of the Iltism system, with some arguing that in certain contexts it could be relatively stable, while many others emphasize its inherent tendencies towards exploitation and enterprise. Its detrimental effects on agricultural productivity and peasant welfare, especially in later centuries as central control weakened. The consequences of this heavy and often corruptly administered tax burden were manifold and frequently devastating. Many peasants found themselves trapped in a cycle of debt. If a harvest failed due to drought or blight, or if an extraordinary tax was levied at an inopportune time, you might be forced to borrow money from local moneylenders who often charged exorbitant rates of interest, or from the tax farmer himself, just to meet your obligations. This debt could then accumulate year after year, until you were effectively working just to pay off the interest, with no hope of ever clearing the principal. It's like a medieval payday loan scheme, only with fewer catchy jingles, and a much higher chance of losing your ancestral olive grove. Loss of land was a common outcome for those who fell too deeply into debt or who simply could not meet the relentless demands of the tax collectors. Your small farm, perhaps tilled by your family for generations, could be seized and sold off, leaving you landless, destitute, and forced to become a hired laborer if you could find work, or to join the swelling ranks of the urban poor in the cities. This process contributed to the concentration of land in the hands of wealthy notables, tax farmers, and powerful officials, altering the social and economic fabric of the countryside. In some cases, the tax burden became so intolerable that peasants resorted to flight, abandoning their villages and their lands to seek refuge in more remote, less accessible areas, or trying to lose themselves in the anonymity of the cities. This peasant flight, or Schiffbosen, literally pairbreaker, referring to the breaking up of a peasant household's land unit, could lead to rural depopulation in certain regions, a decline in agricultural output, and significant social unrest. The Ottoman state, of course, viewed peasant flight with great alarm, as it eroded the tax base and threatened the agricultural foundation of the empire. Laws were enacted to try and prevent it, and runaway peasants, if caught, could be forcibly returned to their villages. But the desperation was often too great. Occasionally, the accumulated grievances over taxation, corruption, and official oppression would boil over into open revolt. Peasant uprisings, often fueled by religious or millenarian ideologies, did occur in various parts of the Ottoman Empire throughout its history. These revolts, however, were almost invariably met with overwhelming military force and brutal suppression by the state. The ringleaders would be executed, often in horrific ways, and entire communities might be punished as an example to others. For you, the individual peasant, joining a tax revolt was an act of ultimate desperation, a gamble with almost impossibly long odds, where the price of failure was not just your own life, but potentially the destruction of your entire village. A quirky or fringe tidbit regarding taxation. Sometimes, Ottoman officials, in their never-ending quest for revenue, came up with rather inventive, if not entirely popular, taxes. There are mentions in some historical sources of taxes on things like singing, or even on bachelors, presumably to encourage marriage, and thus the creation of new taxable households. While the widespread applicability and enforcement of such niche taxes are debatable, they do illustrate the creative lengths to which a pre-modern state might go to try and extract resources from its population. Imagine getting a tax bill for excessive cheerfulness or failure to produce a sufficient number of taxable offspring this fiscal year. It certainly puts modern tax codes into a new perspective. So, for you, the ordinary subject of the Ottoman Empire, particularly if you were part of the vast agricultural peasantry, life was a constant struggle, not just against the elements and the uncertainties of nature, but also against the relentless, often crushing, weight of the imperial tax machine, the grandeur of the Topkapi Palace, the might of the Janissary armies, the splendor of the imperial mosques, all of this was built quite literally on your back, on the surplus extracted from your endless toil. The feeling of working so hard, only to see so much of it disappear into the coffers of distant masters. The gnawing anxiety of not knowing if you could meet the next demand. The bitter taste of injustice when faced with a corrupt official or a rapacious tax farmer. These were the everyday realities that made life suck for so many. It was a system designed to sustain an empire, but often at a brutal cost to the individuals who formed its base. And that, our weary Ottoman peasant, is a heavy burden to carry, from the first light of dawn to the last aching hour of your working day. You've felt the relentless grind of the Ottoman taxman, haven't you? Imagined yourself as Mehmet the Anatolian farmer, or Dragana the Balkan villager. Your back aching from endless toil, your heart sinking at the sight of the Miltizin coming to claim a crippling share of your meager harvest. That was life for the vast majority, a constant struggle for sustenance under the heavy shadow of imperial demands. But now, let us shift our gaze from the sun-baked fields and dusty villages to a world of unimaginable opulence, of silken drapes and jeweled kaftans, of whispered secrets and deadly intrigues, a world hidden deep within the labyrinthine heart of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, the imperial harem. It sounds exotic, perhaps even alluring, doesn't it? A place of legendary beauty, of pampered women living lives of indolent luxury, all dedicated to the pleasure of the all-powerful sultan. But pull back those perfumed curtains, my friend, and you'll find that the harem, for many of its inhabitants, was less a sensual paradise and more a golden cage. Its glittering bars forged from confinement, competition, and a profound lack of personal freedom. This, too, is a reason why life in the Ottoman Empire, even for those seemingly at the pinnacle of comfort, could very much suck. Imagine you are no longer a peasant wrestling with a stubborn plow, but a young woman, perhaps captured in a distant war, or purchased from a slave market in a Black Sea port, or even presented as a gift from some provincial governor eager to curry favor with the Padishah. You are beautiful, or at least possess some quality deemed desirable by the palace procurers. Your old life, your family, your name, your language, your faith, all are being systematically stripped away from you as you pass through the imposing gates of the harem. The Darasad abode of felicity, a name that will soon strike you as a rather cruel irony. You are now an odalisque, a chambermaid or attendant, at the very bottom of a complex and rigidly enforced hierarchy. Your future entirely dependent on catching the eye of one man, or perhaps, more pragmatically, on pleasing the powerful women who rule this secluded, female-dominated world within a world. A mainstream historical fact for you. The Ottoman imperial harem was not simply the Sultan's private pleasure dome, as often sensationally depicted in Western imagination. It was a vast and complex institution, a royal household, a training school for female slaves who would become wives or concubines of the Sultan or other high officials, and crucially, the nursery for future sultans. At its peak, it could house hundreds, even thousands, of women. The Sultan's mother, the valid Sultan, his wives, Kadın Efendis or Hasikis, his favored concubines, Iqbals and Guzdas, his unmarried sisters and daughters, and a vast army of female attendants, servants, and their eunuch guardians. It was a self-contained society with its own rules, its own power structures, and its own unique brand of quiet, often suffocating brutality. Your entry into this world is a bewildering and terrifying experience. You are likely given a new Turkish or Persian name, prettier, more exotic than your own. You are bathed, perfumed, dressed in fine new clothes, but these luxuries cannot mask the stark reality of your situation. You are in essence a slave, your body, and your will now belonging to the Sultan. You are taught the Turkish language, the intricate etiquette of the Ottoman court, the fundamentals of Islam if you are not already Muslim. Conversion was usually expected, though not always strictly enforced for all harem inhabitants in the same way as for Devshirme boys. Your education focuses on making you a pleasing and accomplished companion. You learn to play musical instruments, to sing, to dance, to embroider with exquisite skill, perhaps to recite poetry. And of course, you are schooled in the arts of pleasing, those nebulous skills deemed essential for capturing and retaining the attention of the one man whose favor could elevate you from obscurity to unimaginable power, or condemn you to a lifetime of gilded insignificance. It's like being enrolled in a very exclusive, very high-stakes finishing school, where the final exam involves charming the most powerful man in the world. And failure means, well, you don't want to fail. Life within the harem's walls is governed by a strict hierarchy, and at its apex is the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. Her power and influence can be immense, often extending far beyond the harem into the affairs of state. She manages the harem's vast household and budget, oversees the education and discipline of its inhabitants, and often acts as a key advisor to her son, the sultan. To displease the Valide Sultan is a very bad idea indeed. Beneath her are the sultan's official wives. He was permitted up to 4 by Islamic law. Though this practice varied and his favored concubines, the Hasaki Sultan's a title given to a chief consort, especially one who had borne a son or cadence effendis. These women, particularly if they were mothers of potential heirs, could also wield considerable power and influence, commanding their own retinues and vying fiercely for the Sultan's attention and for the advancement of their own sons. Then came the ranks of lesser concubines, the Iqbal's favorites and Guzdas in the eye, those who had caught the Sultan's notice, and below them the vast numbers of Adalasklar and other female servants and trainees. It's a pyramid of power, and you, our newcomer, are right at the very bottom, hoping to catch a favorable updraft. Daily life is a mixture of structured routine, intense competition, and stultifying boredom. You might spend hours at your lessons, or practicing your accomplishments, or performing your assigned duties within the harem's vast machinery. There are moments of beauty. Certainly the exquisite Iznik tiles adorning the walls, the scent of jasmine and roses from the harem gardens, the cool murmur of fountains in secluded courtyards, the luxurious feel of silk and velvet. But this beauty is always contained, always enclosed. You are a bird in a very ornate, very expensive cage. You rarely, if ever, leave the confines of the harem. Your interactions with the outside world are severely restricted. Your every movement monitored by the ever-watchful Kapi Aga chief, white eunuch, and his subordinates, or the Kisler Aga chief, black eunuch, who oversaw the harem women more directly. These eunuchs, themselves often slaves who had risen to positions of considerable power, were the guardians of the harem's virtue, the enforcers of its strict rules, and often key players in its intricate political games. They were your jailers, your protectors, and sometimes your confidantes, or your most dangerous enemies. It's like living in a very exclusive sorority house run by extremely powerful and surgically altered hall monitors. The ultimate goal for most women in the harem is to catch the Sultan's eye, to be chosen for his bed. This is not necessarily about romantic love, though affection might sometimes develop. It is about survival, about status, about the possibility of advancement. If you please the Sultan, if you become one of his favorites, your position within the harem improves dramatically. You receive better apartments, finer clothes, more servants, greater influence. And if by some miracle of fate and biology you bear him a son, your status skyrockets. You become the mother of a potential future sultan, a Shehzad prince, and your own power and security are inextricably linked to his. This is why the harem was often a hotbed of intense and sometimes lethal rivalry between the sultan's women. Each was vying for his attention, each hoping to produce the heir who would one day rule the empire, each fiercely protective of her own children and her own position. It makes modern office politics look like a friendly game of musical chairs, a quirky or fringe tidbit for you. There were various harem customs and superstitions surrounding fertility and attracting the sultan's favor. A woman might wear specific amulets, consult with fortune tellers or wise women within the harem, or perform private rituals, all in the hope of conceiving a child, preferably a son, or becoming the sultan's next beloved. The famous dropping of the handkerchief by the sultan to indicate his choice of companion for the night, while perhaps a romanticized image, hints at the ritualized and often impersonal nature of these encounters, where a woman's entire future could hang on such a fleeting gesture. Imagine the anxiety, the desperate hope, invested in the rustle of a piece of silk. The path to power through motherhood was a perilous one. While bearing a son elevated your status, it also plunged you directly into the dangerous game of dynastic succession. If your son eventually became sultan, you, as the valid sultan, would wield immense power. But what if another of the sultan's sons, by a rival concubine, was chosen or managed to seize the throne? Your own son might be executed. The infamous Ottoman practice of fraternal fratricide, sanctioned to prevent civil war, was a brutal reality for many centuries, and your own position could become incredibly precarious. The mothers of princes lived in a state of constant vigilance, fiercely promoting their own sons' interests, forging alliances, and guarding against the plots and machinations of their rivals. Poisonings, false accusations, and subtle campaigns of character assassination were not uncommon weapons in this high-stakes maternal Hunger Games. Historians still argue about the true extent of the political power wielded by these influential harem women. Was the Sultanate of Women a period in the 16th and 17th centuries when women of the harem, particularly valid sultans and hasakis, exerted extraordinary political influence, a sign of their genuine agency? Or was it merely an aberration, a symptom of weak male rule, their power always derivative and ultimately dependent on their relationship with the reigning sultan or their princely sons? For the vast majority of women in the harem, however, this path to ultimate power remained an impossible dream. Most would live out their lives in varying degrees of gilded obscurity. Some might catch the sultan's fancy for a brief period, only to be superseded by a new favorite. Others might never attract his attention at all, remaining as high-level domestic servants or companions to the more favored women. After a certain number of years of service, or if they failed to produce children, or simply if the sultan or validate sultan wished it, many harem women were eventually married off to high-ranking officials or provincial governors. This was seen as a reward, a way of providing them with a secure and respectable position in the outside world. But it was still not a choice they made themselves. They were once again assets, their harem training and their connection, however tenuous, to the imperial family, making them desirable wives for ambitious men, seeking to enhance their own status and forge closer ties to the palace. It's like being given a very nice severance package after years of dedicated, if somewhat unfulfilling, service. Only the package includes a brand new husband you've probably never met. The brutality of harem life then was not always one of overt physical cruelty, though discipline could be harsh and the rivalries could certainly turn deadly. It was the brutality of confinement, of lost identity, of a life lived entirely at the whim of others. It was the constant pressure to please, to compete, to scheme for survival and advancement in a closed, artificial world. It was the loneliness, the homesickness, the yearning for a life of genuine freedom and personal choice that would, for most, remain forever out of reach. Even the opulence, the luxury, the beautiful surroundings could come to feel like a mockery, the glittering bars of an inescapable cage. You might wear silks, eat delicacies, and be surrounded by beauty. But you were not free. Your body, your future, your very emotions were all subservient to the needs of the sultan and the perpetuation of his dynasty. And that, our imprisoned harem inhabitant, is a profound and deeply sucking form of existence, However perfumed and bejeweled its cage might be, you've peered through the intricately carved screens of the imperial harem, haven't you? Imagine the lives of those women, trapped in a world of shimmering silk and silent, often deadly, rivalries. Their existence a testament to the Sultan's absolute power and the dynastic obsessions of an empire. That was a gilded cage, certainly, a world of privilege and peril reserved for a select few. But now, let us step outside the palace walls, beyond the immediate orbit of imperial favor and intrigue, and into the bustling, diverse, and often deeply unequal society of the Ottoman Empire at large. For if you were not a Muslim, if you belonged to one of the many Christian, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Serb, Bulgarian, Coptic, and more or Jewish communities that constituted a significant portion of the empire's population, your life was governed by a different set of rules, a different kind of societal cage, one perhaps less gilded but no less confining. You were a dhimmi, a protected person under Islamic law. And while that protection offered a degree of security unknown to religious minorities in many parts of contemporary Christendom, it came at a distinct price. A clearly defined, legally enshrined, and often palpably felt second-class existence. This, for many, was another profound reason why life in the Ottoman domains could, to put it mildly, suck. Imagine yourself now as, say, Gregorios, a Greek merchant in Smyrna, or perhaps Rivka, a Jewish artisan in Salonika, or maybe Stefan, a Serbian farmer in a Balkan village that has already felt the sting of the devshirme. Your ancestors might have lived in these lands for centuries, long before the Ottoman sultans swept in with their conquering armies. You have your own faith, your own language, your own customs, your own vibrant community. But you are now living under the rule of a Muslim empire, and the legal and social framework of that empire makes your subordinate status abundantly clear every single day. This framework was based on the concept of the dhimma, an ancient Islamic legal pact offered to non-Muslim people of the book, primarily Jews and Christians, living under Muslim rule. In exchange for their submission to the state and the payment of a special poll tax, the jizya, dhimmis, were granted protection of their lives, property, and the freedom to practice their religion, albeit with certain significant restrictions. It was a system of tolerated coexistence, not one of equality. You were allowed to exist, to worship, to trade, but always as a distinct and lesser group. It's like being a permanent guest in someone else's very large, very powerful house. A guest who pays rent and is allowed to use the spare room, but who must never forget who owns the deeds and sets the rules. The most tangible and often most resented symbol of this subordinate status was the jizya. We touched upon it earlier as one of the many taxes that could make life a misery. But for dhimmis, it was more than just a financial burden. It was a constant yearly reminder of their subjugation. This poll tax was levied on adult, able-bodied, non-Muslim males. A mainstream historical fact for you: the collection of the jizya was often carried out in a manner designed to emphasize the dhimmi's inferior status. The taxpayer might be required to approach the collector humbly, sometimes even to be lightly struck on the neck or back as the payment was made. A ritualistic act of submission. While the severity in specific rituals of collection varied by time and place, the underlying message was clear: you are paying for the privilege of existing as a non-Muslim under Ottoman rule. The amount of the jizya also varied, often graded according to wealth, but it could represent a significant financial strain, especially for poorer families, on top of all the other taxes they were expected to pay. It's the ultimate subscription fee for basic human rights, with an added bonus of ritualized humiliation, just to make sure you get the memo. Beyond the jizya, a whole host of other legal and social restrictions governed your life as a dhimmi. Sumptuary laws, for instance, often dictated what you could and couldn't wear. You might be forbidden from wearing certain colors, particularly green, which was associated with Islam. Your clothing might have to be of a plainer cut, or made from less luxurious fabrics than that of Muslims. You might be required to wear a distinctive patch or a particular type of headgear to clearly identify you as a non-Muslim. These laws were designed to maintain a visible distinction between the ruling Muslim population and the subject Dhimmi communities, to prevent any blurring of the social hierarchy. It's like having a very strict empire-wide dress code, where your outfit constantly screams, "Notice, second-class citizen approaching. Do not treat as equal." Your religious freedoms, while guaranteed in principle, were also circumscribed. You were generally allowed to practice your faith within your own communities, to maintain your churches or synagogues, and to educate your children in your religious traditions. However, the building of new houses of worship was often forbidden, or at least severely restricted, and repairs to existing ones might require special permission, which could be difficult and costly to obtain. Public displays of your religion, loud church bells, prominent crosses on buildings, religious processions in the streets were often prohibited or discouraged, especially in predominantly Muslim areas. Your worship was meant to be discreet, contained, not challenging the dominance of Islam. It's like being told you can have your party, but you have to keep the music down, use the back door, and for heaven's sake, don't let your festive decorations spill out onto the lawn where they might offend the sensibilities of the homeowners association. In legal matters, your status as a dhimmi could put you at a distinct disadvantage. While Dhimmi communities often had a degree of autonomy in managing their internal civil affairs like marriage, divorce, and inheritance according to their own religious laws, in any dispute involving a Muslim, or in criminal cases, you be subject to the Ottoman Islamic courts. Here, the testimony of a non-Muslim against a Muslim was often given less weight, or in some cases not accepted at all. This made it incredibly difficult to obtain justice if you were wronged by a Muslim. A Muslim could, in theory, be punished for harming a dhimmi, as you were under the Sultan's protection. But the burden of proof was high, and the inclination of a Qadi judge to rule against a fellow Muslim in favor of a dhimmi might be, shall we say, limited, especially if the Muslim was well-connected or offered a persuasive gift. It's a legal system where the playing field isn't just tilted, it's practically vertical, and you're trying to kick the ball uphill, wearing lead boots. Socially, you might find yourself living in segregated neighborhoods or quarters within towns and cities, the Mahalla system often reinforcing communal boundaries. While this could provide a sense of security and allow for the flourishing of your own distinct cultural and religious life, it also limited your interaction with the wider Muslim society and reinforced your separateness. You might be forbidden from riding horses, a privilege often reserved for Muslims, symbolizing their martial status, or from carrying weapons. Your houses were sometimes required to be lower than those of your Muslim neighbors. These were all constant, visible reminders of your subordinate place in the Ottoman social order. It's like living in a permanent state of being the slightly embarrassing, tolerated cousin at the grand family gathering. However, it's also important to acknowledge the complexities and nuances of the dhimmi experience, which varied significantly across the vast expanse and long history of the Ottoman Empire. Historians still argue about the overall nature of Ottoman tolerance. Was it a relatively benign and pragmatic system of coexistence, especially when compared to the often brutal persecution of religious minorities in contemporary Christian Europe? Think the Spanish Inquisition, or the religious wars that ravaged the ravaged continent? Or was it a system of institutionalized discrimination that, while perhaps not always overtly violent, nevertheless created a fundamentally unequal and often humiliating existence for its non-Muslim subjects? The answer, as is so often the case in history, is probably both, and it depends. There were periods of greater tolerance and prosperity for dhimmi communities, and periods of increased restriction and persecution. Much depended on the reigning sultan, the political climate, the zeal of local officials, and the specific economic or strategic importance of the dhimmi community in question. Certain groups, like Greek phanariates, Armenian merchants, or Jewish physicians and financiers, were able to achieve considerable wealth and influence, playing vital roles in the empire's administration, commerce, and diplomacy, despite their dhimmi status. The Ottoman state, in its pragmatic way, often recognized and utilized the skills and networks of its non-Muslim subjects. It was a system that could be surprisingly flexible and opportunistic. The millet system, which became more formalized in later centuries, but had its roots in earlier practices, granted a significant degree of autonomy to the major non-Muslim religious communities. Each millet, headed by its religious leader, a patriarch for the Orthodox Christians, a chief rabbi for the Jews, etc., was allowed to manage its own internal affairs, education, religious law, charitable institutions, even the collection of some taxes with relatively little interference from the Ottoman state, as long as loyalty and the jizya were maintained. This allowed these communities to preserve their religious and cultural identities over centuries of Ottoman rule, a testament to their resilience and the often pragmatic nature of Ottoman governance. It was a kind of imperial multiculturalism, albeit one firmly rooted in a hierarchical structure with Muslims at the top. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you: some dhimmi communities developed unique cultural expressions that blended elements of their own traditions with Ottoman influences, creating vibrant hybrid forms in music, art, cuisine, and even language. For instance, Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, spoken by Sephardic Jews who found refuge in the Ottoman Empire after their expulsion from Spain in 1492, is a fascinating example of a language that preserved medieval Spanish while absorbing Turkish, Greek, and Hebrew elements. It's a reminder that cultural interaction, even within a framework of inequality, can lead to rich and unexpected creations. It's like when your very traditional grandmother tries to use modern slang. The result can be surprisingly delightful, or occasionally just deeply confusing. But despite these areas of autonomy and occasional opportunity, the underlying reality for you as a dhimmi was one of vulnerability. Your protected status was ultimately dependent on the goodwill of your Muslim rulers. In times of political instability, economic hardship, or heightened religious fervor, perhaps sparked by a war against a Christian power, dhimmi communities could become easy scapegoats, subject to popular resentment, official extortion, or even outbreaks of violence. The rules governing your existence, those carefully defined restrictions, could be tightened or reinterpreted at any time. The devshirme, that levy of Christian boys we discussed with such dread, was perhaps the most extreme example of this vulnerability. A brutal reminder that the protection offered by the Dhimma Pact could be selectively and devastatingly overridden by the perceived needs of the Ottoman state. The psychological toll of living as a second-class citizen, of constantly having to be mindful of your words and actions, of knowing that your rights were circumscribed and your security conditional, should not be underestimated. It could breed a sense of resentment, of internalized inferiority, or a fierce, quiet determination to preserve your identity and your dignity in the face of systemic discrimination. It was a life lived on a different footing, a path that required resilience, cunning, and a deep well of communal solidarity to navigate successfully. For you, Gregorios, Rivka, or Stefan, the grandeur of the Ottoman Empire, its mighty armies and magnificent mosques, might have been a source of awe, but it was also a constant reminder of your own subjugated place within its vast, divinely ordained, and often deeply inequitable order. And that, my friend, is a pretty good reason why your life, in this particular historical imagining, might have felt like it thoroughly sucked. You've walked in the metaphorical shoes of a dhimmi, our non-Muslim subject of the Ottoman Sultan, haven't you? Navigated the delicate path of tolerated coexistence with its special taxes, its social restrictions, and the constant underlying awareness of your second-class status within the vast imperial mosaic. That was a specific kind of suck, a life lived under a particular set of legal and social constraints. But now, let us broaden our focus. For there were certain miseries in the Ottoman Empire that transcended religious divides, afflictions that could make life profoundly unpleasant and often dangerously precarious. for Muslim and non-Muslim alike, especially if you happen to live in one of its many bustling, vibrant, and frequently rather squalid urban centers. Forget the romantic images of gleaming minarets and exotic bazaars for a moment. We're about to wade, perhaps quite literally, through the filth, fire, and pestilence that often characterized city life, revealing why, for many an urban dweller, their metropolitan existence could be a constant nerve-wracking battle against unseen enemies. Imagine yourself now as, say, Yusuf, a cobbler in a crowded Istanbul neighborhood, or perhaps Fatima, a weaver in the teeming city of Cairo, or even young Murad, an apprentice in a bustling Aleppo. So you've been drawn to the city, or perhaps born into it, by the promise of work, of opportunity, of the sheer excitement and diversity that these great urban hubs offered. And in many ways, Ottoman cities were indeed magnificent centers of commerce, culture, and religious life. They boasted grand mosques, sprawling palaces, intricate fountains, bustling markets overflowing with goods from across the known world, and a cosmopolitan mix of peoples, languages, and traditions. But beneath this glittering surface, often hidden in the narrow, winding alleyways and the densely packed residential quarters, lay a darker reality, a world where the daily threat of disease, the ever-present danger of catastrophic fire, and the pervasive presence of filth could make urban life a decidedly challenging, and sometimes downright deadly, proposition. Dull. It's like moving to a glamorous metropolis today, lured by the bright lights and career prospects, only to discover that your trendy downtown apartment has no running water, the garbage hasn't been collected since the last siege, and your friendly neighborhood rats are organized enough to demand rent. Let's start with the basics: sanitation, or rather, the conspicuous lack thereof in many parts of a typical Ottoman city. While the empire prided itself on its public baths, hammams, which were indeed marvels of architecture and important centers of social life and ritual cleansing, the general approach to waste disposal and public hygiene in residential areas often left a great deal to be desired. There were no comprehensive city-wide sewage systems as we would understand them. Human waste was often disposed of in cesspits located beneath or near houses, which could overflow or leak, contaminating the soil and nearby water sources. Alternatively, it might simply be tossed into the street, especially at night, with a cursory warning shout of "Destur! Make way!" joining the general accumulation of animal dung, household garbage, and the refuse from various trades like tanneries or slaughterhouses. The streets themselves were often narrow, unpaved, and poorly drained, turning into muddy, stinking quagmires after rain, and dusty, fly-blown tracks in dry weather. It's not exactly the picturesque cobblestone lane you see on postcards. It's more like a very challenging, very smelly obstacle course. Drinking water was another constant concern. While major cities often had impressive aqueducts and public fountains, cheshmes and siebels, endowed by sultans or wealthy patrons to provide fresh water, the distribution to individual households was often haphazard. Water carriers might bring water from these public sources, but its cleanliness could be compromised along the way. Wells within the city could easily become contaminated by seepage from latrines or by surface runoff. This lack of clean, reliable drinking water was a primary vector for the spread of numerous diseases. You might think twice before enjoying that refreshing cup of water on a hot day, wondering what unseen horrors might be lurking within. It's like playing Russian roulette with your digestive system every single day. A mainstream historical fact for you: Ottoman cities, like most pre-modern urban centers, struggled immensely with waste management. While there were some municipal efforts, such as street sweepers in certain areas or regulations about where refuse could be dumped, these were often overwhelmed by the sheer volume of waste generated by a dense population. The concept of a centralized sanitary landfill was still centuries in the future. So, garbage tended to accumulate in piles, in alleyways, in vacant lots, attracting vermin, and creating a pervasive, inescapable miasma of unpleasant odors. Imagine the bouquet. Rotting vegetables, animal carcasses, human excrement, industrial waste, all gently baking in the summer sun or festering in the winter damp. It's a smell that would cling to your clothes, your hair, your very soul. You'd probably need a whole separate wardrobe just for going outside and trying not to pass out from the stench. This pervasive filth and lack of sanitation created a paradise for pests. Rats, mice, flies, fleas. Lice, these were your unwelcome and often unavoidable housemates. They thrived in the accumulated garbage, the dirty streets, the crowded living conditions. And they weren't just an unsightly nuisance. They were carriers of disease, most notably the fleas on rats, which were the primary vectors for the bubonic plague. You might spend a good portion of your day swatting flies, scratching flea bites, and trying to keep the rats from making off with your dinner. It's like living in a nature documentary about the less glamorous aspects of the animal kingdom, only you're the unwilling star. And the director is a very large, very unhygienic rat with a PhD in epidemiology. And this brings us to the ever-present, terrifying specter of epidemic disease. Ottoman cities, like their counterparts in Europe and elsewhere, were regularly ravaged by devastating outbreaks of plague. The Black Death of the 14th century was just the most infamous of many recurrences. Cholera, dysentery, smallpox, typhus, and a host of other infectious illnesses. These diseases, thriving in the unsanitary conditions and spreading rapidly through densely packed populations, could wipe out significant portions of a city's inhabitants in a matter of weeks or months. When the plague hit, fear and panic would grip the city. Shops would close, streets would empty, except for the grim passage of the death carts. Families would barricade themselves in their homes, often to no avail. Medical understanding of how these diseases spread was limited, while some Ottoman physicians, influenced by classical and Islamic medical traditions, did advocate for measures like quarantine tahafutsane, isolation of the sick, and improved public hygiene. These efforts were often hampered by popular fatalism, religious interpretations that saw plagues as divine punishment, and the sheer overwhelming scale of the outbreaks. Historians still argue about the relative effectiveness of Ottoman public health measures and quarantine practices compared to those in contemporary Europe, with some suggesting the Ottomans were, in certain periods, surprisingly advanced, while others point to the recurrent devastation as evidence of their ultimate inadequacy. Imagine living through a plague epidemic. The air is filled with the smell of sickness, of death, of burning herbs used in a desperate attempt to purify the atmosphere. You hear the wails of mourning from neighboring houses, the tolling of bells, if permitted, for the dead. You see the dreaded plague sores appearing on your loved ones, or perhaps on your own body. There is no effective cure. Some might flee the city, if they have somewhere to go and the means to do so, though this could also spread the disease further. Most are trapped, waiting, praying, hoping that the pestilence will pass them by. It is a terrifying, indiscriminate killer, striking rich and poor, Muslim and dhimmi, young and old, with brutal impartiality. The psychological toll of living under such a constant threat, of seeing your friends, your family, your neighbors succumb to these horrific illnesses, must have been immense. It's like living in a constant state of red alert, where the invisible enemy could be lurking on any surface, in any breath of air, in any chance encounter. And if disease wasn't enough to make your urban existence precarious, there was also the ever-present danger of fire. Ottoman cities, particularly residential areas, were often a tinderbox of wooden houses closely packed together, with narrow, winding streets that could act as perfect funnels for a conflagration. A carelessly tended cooking fire, an overturned oil lamp, a spark from a tradesman's forge, any of these could ignite a blaze that, fanned by the wind, could sweep through entire neighborhoods with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. Firefighting efforts were rudimentary. While some cities had organized groups of firemen, the Tulumbayjula in later periods were famous for their bravery and somewhat theatrical methods. Their equipment usually consisted of little more than buckets, axes, and long hooks to pull down burning structures and create fire breaks. Water was often scarce, and access to the heart of a blaze through narrow, crowded streets was incredibly difficult. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you. Some Ottoman firefighting techniques involved quickly demolishing houses in the path of the fire to create a break, which, while sometimes effective, wasn't always popular, with the owners of the houses being preemptively demolished. Sorry about your ancestral home, old chap, but it was either that or the entire district goes up. Here's a bucket of water for your trouble. A major fire in an Ottoman city was a terrifying spectacle of chaos and destruction. The roar of the flames, the crash of collapsing buildings, the screams of those trapped or trying to rescue their meager possessions, the thick, choking smoke that blotted out the sun. It was a vision of hell on earth. You might have only minutes to flee your home, grabbing your children and whatever few valuables you could carry, leaving everything else to be consumed by the inferno. And after the fire had passed, you would be faced with devastation. Your home gone, your livelihood destroyed, perhaps family members lost or injured. Rebuilding was a slow and arduous process, and often the same flammable conditions would simply be recreated, setting the stage for the next inevitable disaster. It's like living on the slopes of a very active, very unpredictable volcano that occasionally decides to redecorate your entire neighborhood with molten lava and ash. Beyond these natural, or at least environmentally exacerbated disasters, urban life could also be disrupted by other perils. Earthquakes were a threat in some seismically active regions of the empire. Food shortages due to drought, crop failure, or disruptions to trade routes could lead to soaring prices. Widespread hunger and sometimes violent bread riots in the cities, as desperate people took to the streets to demand relief. Political instability, a change of sultan, or a revolt by disgruntled janissaries could also spill over into urban violence and looting. The city, for all its attractions, was often a volatile and dangerous place, where your personal security and well-being could be threatened by a host of forces beyond your control. The suck factor here is the sheer relentless accumulation of environmental and social hazards, the feeling that you are constantly navigating a minefield of potential disasters with very little in the way of a safety net. Your home might burn down, the plague might carry off your family, your livelihood might be destroyed by a sudden famine, and there would be little or no official aid to help you recover. You were largely on your own, or dependent on the charity of your community, to pick up the pieces and try to survive. It's a precarious existence, lived on the edge, where the glittering promise of the city often masked a grim and brutal struggle for daily survival against the pervasive realities of filth, fire, and pestilence. You've navigated the treacherous streets of an Ottoman city, haven't you? Dodged the overflowing cesspits, held your breath against the miasma of accumulated filth, perhaps even survived a terrifying outbreak of plague or a catastrophic fire, all part of the dubious joys of urban living we just explored. That was a battle against the often unseen, impersonal forces of disease and disaster. But what happened when your troubles were more personal, more man-made? What if you were cheated by a merchant, your land encroached upon by a powerful neighbor, or your good name slandered in the marketplace? You would, in theory, turn to the law, to the Ottoman system of justice, hoping for redress, for fairness, for a restoration of your rights. But as you, our aggrieved Ottoman subject, are about to discover, seeking justice in this empire could often feel like wandering into a vast, bewildering labyrinth, a maze of religious law, sultanic decrees, and local custom, where the path to a fair outcome was frequently obscured by the long shadows of corruption, influence, and the arbitrary whims of those in power. For many, the law's labyrinth was another profound reason why life under the Padishah could, quite frankly, suck. The Ottoman Empire, it must be said, prided itself on being a state governed by law. Two main streams of legal thought flowed through its veins: Sharia, the sacred law of Islam, derived from the Quran, the Sunnah sayings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad, and the interpretations of learned Islamic scholars, the ulama. And Qadaan, or secular, sultanic law, comprising the decrees, firmans, and regulations issued by the sultans themselves to address matters not explicitly covered by Sharia, particularly in areas of administration, taxation, and criminal justice. In theory, these two systems were meant to complement each other, creating a comprehensive legal framework that ensured justice and order throughout the vast domains. The local qadi, or judge, usually a man trained in Islamic jurisprudence, was the cornerstone of this system at the grassroots level, responsible for adjudicating disputes, probating wills, registering contracts, and generally upholding the law in his district. His court was, in principle, accessible to all, Muslim and non-Muslim, rich and poor alike. Sounds rather fair and equitable, doesn't it? Like a well-oiled machine of justice, dispensing impartial rulings from a conveniently located neighborhood courthouse. Ah, if only it were always so simple. Imagine yourself, Yusuf the cobbler, your small workshop ransacked, your best leather stolen by a swaggering janissary who claims you insulted his pointy hat. Or perhaps you are Fatima the weaver, your beautifully crafted textiles devalued by a merchant who now refuses to pay the agreed price. Or maybe you are Stefan the Balkan farmer, your ancestral boundary stones mysteriously moved yet again by your powerful and acquisitive neighbor, a local ayan notable with friends in high places. Your first instinct, your only recourse, is to take your case to the qadi. You gather your witnesses, if you have any brave enough to speak against a janissary or a local bigwig. You prepare your plea, perhaps with the help of a literate friend or a professional petition writer, if you cannot write yourself. And then you enter the qadi's court, a space that might be a modest room in his own house or a more formal chamber in a public building, its atmosphere thick with the scent of old paper, nervous petitioners, and the slightly intimidating aura of judicial authority. The qadi himself, a figure often robed and turbaned, sits on a raised platform or a simple cushion, perhaps with a clerk beside him to record the proceedings. He listens to your complaint, then to the defendant's response, if the defendant has even bothered to show up, which wasn't always a given, especially if they were powerful. He might question witnesses, examine any documents you can produce, and consult his legal texts. A mainstream historical fact for you. Qadis in the Ottoman Empire were expected to be well versed in Hanafi jurisprudence, which was the dominant school of Islamic law in the empire, though they might also consider local customs urf in their rulings. Their training involved years of study in a Medris Islamic college, and their appointment was, in theory, based on merit and learning. Many qadis were undoubtedly learned, pious and conscientious men who genuinely strove to dispense impartial justice. However, the system was far from perfect, and the path to a just outcome was often strewn with obstacles that could make Sisyphus uphill struggle with his boulder look like a leisurely stroll in the park. One of the most pervasive and corrosive problems was corruption. While the salaries of qadis were often modest, their positions could be incredibly lucrative if they were inclined to supplement their income through less official channels. Bribery was, in many times and places, an open secret, and accepted, if officially condemned, part of doing business with the legal system. If your opponent in a lawsuit was wealthier or better connected than you, he might discreetly offer the qadi a gift, a purse of silver, a fine carpet, perhaps a promise of future favors to ensure a favorable verdict. You might find your clearly articulated case, supported by numerous honest witnesses, suddenly crumbling before a series of inexplicable legal interpretations, or the qadi's abrupt dismissal of your evidence. It's like playing a rigged game, where the referee has clearly been bought by the other team, and your protests are met with a serene, anachronistic smile and a suggestion that perhaps you should have considered investing more in judicial goodwill. The influence of powerful local notables, landowners, Military commanders, wealthy merchants, even influential religious figures could also heavily sway the course of justice. These individuals often had the qadi in their pocket, either through outright bribery, intimidation, or the complex web of patronage and obligation that characterized Ottoman society. If your dispute was with one of these local magnates, or even with one of their favored retainers, your chances of receiving a fair hearing were slim to none, regardless of the merits of your case. The qadi, mindful of his own career prospects, or perhaps even his personal safety, would be highly unlikely to rule against such a powerful figure. Justice, in these instances, was not blind. It was squinting very hard, trying to see which way the wind of local power was blowing. It's like trying to get a parking ticket overturned when the person who ticketed you also happens to be the mayor's cousin, the chief of police, and the owner of the only tow truck company in town. Good luck with that. Even if the qadi himself was honest and well-intentioned, the sheer volume of cases, the complexity of some disputes, and the difficulty of enforcing judgments in a vast and often loosely administered empire could lead to frustrating delays, and often, ultimately, justice denied. You might spend weeks, even months, waiting for your case to be heard, your resources dwindling, your patience wearing thin. And even if you received a favorable verdict, actually getting it enforced against a reluctant or powerful opponent could be another ordeal altogether. The qadi might issue an order, but if the local governor or the janissary commander wasn't inclined to back it up with force, that piece of paper might be worth less than the ink it was written on. For non-Muslim dhimmis, seeking justice in an Ottoman court, especially in a case against a Muslim, presented its own unique set of challenges, as we've touched upon. While Sharia law in theory guaranteed them protection and access to the legal system, the practice could be very different. The rule that a dhimmi's testimony against a Muslim was often given less weight, or disallowed entirely in certain types of cases, created an inherent imbalance. Imagine trying to prove that a Muslim merchant cheated you, when your own word, and that of your fellow dhimmi witnesses, is automatically considered less credible than his. It's a system that almost invites abuse, a legal playing field tilted so steeply, it's a wonder anyone even bothered to try and play. Historians still debate the extent to which dhimmi communities relied on their own internal communal courts for resolving disputes amongst themselves, versus how often they were compelled or chose to use the Ottoman qadi courts. And what factors influenced these choices? The punishments prescribed by Ottoman law, both Sharia and Qanun, could also be incredibly harsh by modern standards, and often designed as much for public deterrence as for retribution or rehabilitation. For theft, you might lose a hand. For adultery, you could face stoning, though this was rarely carried out in its full severity. Flogging was more common. For rebellion or treason, the penalties were invariably gruesome and fatal: impalement, strangulation, beheading. Public executions and punishments were common spectacles, intended to instill fear and reinforce the authority of the state. While these might be seen as justice by some, for the person on the receiving end or their grieving family, it was simply another facet of the empire's brutality. And the arbitrary nature of some sentences, the possibility that a minor offense could be met with a disproportionately severe punishment if you angered the wrong official, or if the qadi was having a particularly bad day, added another layer of terror to any encounter with the legal system. It's like getting a life sentence for a parking violation because the judge didn't like your taste in music. A quirky or fringe tidbit for you. In some Ottoman court records, you find fascinating, and occasionally rather bizarre, cases being adjudicated. Disputes over runaway donkeys, arguments about the quality of a purchased singing bird, accusations of witchcraft or sorcery leading to a neighbor's prize-winning cucumbers wilting. The cadis heard it all. While some of these might seem trivial or even amusing to us, they were deadly serious matters for the people involved. and the Qadi's ruling could have a profound impact on their lives and livelihoods. It's a reminder that the law in any society often grapples with the full, messy, and sometimes utterly inexplicable spectrum of human behavior. You can almost picture a weary Qadi after a long day of adjudicating donkey disputes and cucumber curses, just wanting to go home and soak his feet in a bucket of lukewarm water, wondering why he didn't choose a less stressful profession, like say, professional lion taming. And what if you felt you had been unjustly treated by a local Qadi or governor? Could you appeal? In theory, yes. The Ottoman system did allow for petitions Arzahal to be sent to higher authorities, even directly to the Sultan's Imperial Council, the Divan-u-Humayun in Istanbul. If your petition was deemed worthy, your case might be reviewed, and an unjust local official could be reprimanded or even dismissed. This right of petition was seen as an important safety valve, a way for the Sultan to maintain a connection with his subjects and to check the abuses of his provincial administrators. However, in practice, submitting a petition was a costly, time-consuming, and often risky undertaking. You would need to travel to a major administrative center or all the way to Istanbul. You would need to pay scribes to draft your petition in the correct formal language. You would need to navigate the layers of bureaucracy, trying to get your plea in front of someone who might actually read it and act upon it. And all the while, you risked incurring the wrath of the very official you were complaining about, who might use his local power to make your life even more miserable, while your petition was slowly wending its way through the imperial machinery. It's like trying to lodge a complaint with an intergalactic bureaucracy that communicates exclusively through interpretive dance and whose customer service line has a hold time measured in geological epochs. So, for you, our Ottoman subject caught in the law's labyrinth, the quest for justice often felt like a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice against a system that was frequently weighted against you, especially if you lacked wealth, connections, or the correct religious affiliation. The ideal of a just and orderly society governed by sacred law and the Sultan's benevolent wisdom often clashed harshly with the reality of corruption, influence peddling, arbitrary decisions, and brutal punishments. This gap between the ideal and the real, this feeling that the scales of justice were often tipped by something other than truth and fairness, was a deep and enduring source of frustration, fear, and a pervasive sense of powerlessness. It was another heavy stone in the already considerable burden of why your life in the Ottoman Empire could, all too often, truly suck. You've navigated the treacherous labyrinth of Ottoman law, haven't you? Felt that sinking despair as justice seemed to slip through your fingers, perhaps obstructed by a corrupt Qadi or the long shadow of a powerful local notable. That was a deeply personal, often infuriating reason why life in the empire could feel like a rigged game. But imagine, now, that this sense of things not quite working as they should, of systems breaking down, begins to permeate not just your local courthouse, but the very fabric of the empire itself. For as the centuries wore on, the once mighty, seemingly invincible Ottoman state, the well-protected domains of the Padishah, entered a long, slow period of decline. A gradual crumbling of order that brought new and often more widespread miseries to its diverse and increasingly restive populations. This, our weary subject of a fading empire, is the final overarching reason why your life, in these later Ottoman centuries, might have truly comprehensively sucked. You are now witnessing the slow, agonizing decay of a world order, and the dust of that disintegration settles heavily on your everyday existence. The precise timing and causes of Ottoman decline are, of course, subjects of endless debate among historians. Was it the 17th century after the last failed siege of Vienna? Was it the 18th, with its increasingly unfavorable treaties and loss of economic dynamism? Or was it a much longer, more complex process, with periods of attempted reform and resurgence interspersed with further decay? Historians still argue whether the decline was primarily due to internal factors: corruption, weakening leadership, technological stagnation, the rise of entrenched anachronistic interests, or external pressures, such as the rise of powerful European nation-states, shifting global trade routes that bypassed Ottoman lands, and the corrosive impact of European economic and political penetration. Regardless of the precise academic arguments for you living through these later centuries, say from the late 1700s through the 1800s and into the early 1900s, the feeling of things slowly unraveling, of the empire becoming the sick man of Europe's, as it was rather condescendingly dubbed by Western powers, would have been an undeniable and deeply unsettling reality. One of the most palpable signs of this decline was the weakening of central authority and the corresponding rise of powerful local notables, or ayans, in the provinces. Remember how the Sultan's absolute power, which we discussed in Section 1, was projected through his governors and officials, while as the central government in Istanbul became less efficient, more consumed by internal palace intrigues, or simply less able to enforce its will across vast distances, these provincial strongmen began to assert greater autonomy. They might still pay lip service to the Sultan, but in reality they often ruled their own regions like personal fiefdoms, levying their own taxes on top of the official ones, naturally, maintaining their own private armies, and maintaining their own private armies. Personalized and often very brutal form of justice. For you, the ordinary peasant or town dweller, this could mean being subject to an even more rapacious and unpredictable form of exploitation than before. Your local ayan might be even harder to appeal against than a corrupt Qadi, because he was the ultimate local authority, and his primary interest was enriching himself and his family, not necessarily the well-being of the Sultan's subjects or the long-term prosperity of the region. It's like your already difficult landlord has now declared himself king of your apartment building and is demanding tribute in the form of your firstborn child and all your good teacups. This breakdown of central control often led to a decline in law and order in many parts of the empire. Banditry became more widespread as dispossessed peasants, demobilized soldiers, or simply opportunistic brigands took advantage of the weakening state presence. Travel became more dangerous, trade routes less secure. You might find your village raided, your livestock stolen, your crops burned with little hope of redress from the distant and increasingly ineffective imperial authorities. The Janissaries themselves, once the elite, disciplined shock troops of the empire, whose creation through the Devshirme we explored with such dread, became in these later centuries a powerful and often disruptive political force, frequently interfering in palace politics, deposing sultans, and contributing to instability rather than order. Their loyalty was often more to their own core and its privileges than to the state. It's as if the Praetorian Guard of ancient Rome had decided to run a particularly rowdy and heavily armed trade union, with a penchant for king-making and occasional citywide looting sprees just to keep things interesting. Economically, the empire faced mounting challenges. The traditional overland trade routes that had once enriched Ottoman coffers were increasingly bypassed as European powers developed new sea routes to Asia. European manufactured goods began to flood Ottoman markets, often undercutting local artisans and industries due to capitulations. A series of commercial treaties granted to European powers that gave their merchants significant trade privileges, exemptions from Ottoman law and taxes within the empire. A mainstream historical fact is that these capitulations, initially intended to foster trade, eventually became a major tool of European economic penetration and a symbol of Ottoman weakness and loss of sovereignty. You, as a local craftsman, say a shoemaker or a textile weaver like our imagined Fatima, might find yourself unable to compete with cheaper, mass-produced European imports. Your livelihood and that of your community would be slowly eroded, leading to unemployment, poverty, and social unrest. It's the pre-modern equivalent of your small artisanal local business being crushed by a giant, faceless international hypermarket that also happens to be exempt from all local taxes and regulations. Seems fair, right? Inflation became a chronic problem as sultans resorted to debasing the currency, reducing the amount of precious metal in coins to meet their ever-increasing expenses. particularly for warfare and the upkeep of the bloated court and bureaucracy. Your hard-earned axes or paras Ottoman coins would buy less and less each year. Prices for basic necessities like bread and oil would soar, while your wages or income from your crops stagnated or declined. The state also accumulated massive debts to European bankers and governments, leading to the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration in 1881, an institution largely controlled by foreign powers, which took over the collection of significant portions of Ottoman state revenue to service these debts. This was a profound humiliation, a clear sign of the empire's loss of economic independence. For you, the ordinary subject, it meant that even more of the wealth produced by your labor was being siphoned off, not just to support your own rulers, but now to pay foreign creditors as well. It's like having your salary garnished not just by your own government, but by a committee of very stern-looking international bankers who set up shop in your living room. Militarily, the once feared Ottoman armies began to suffer a string of defeats at the hands of increasingly modernized and technologically superior European powers, particularly Russia and Austria. Territories that had been part of the empire for centuries in the Balkans, around the Black Sea, in North Africa were gradually lost, either through outright conquest or through the rise of nationalist independence movements among subject peoples. Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, Egyptians, and others who were often supported, covertly or overtly, by rival European powers. Each lost war, each ceded territory, was a blow to imperial prestige and a source of profound anxiety and instability within the remaining domains. Refugees from lost territories might flood into other parts of the empire, creating new social and economic pressures, and the constant warfare, even when unsuccessful, still required men and resources, further burdening an already struggling population. You might find yourself conscripted into an army that was increasingly ill-equipped, poorly led, and destined for defeat, fighting to defend a crumbling frontier for an empire that seemed to be slowly dying on its feet. The psychological impact of this slow, seemingly inexorable decline should not be underestimated. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had seen itself as a divinely favored, invincible world power, a successor to Rome, the leading state of the Islamic world. To witness its gradual erosion, its military humiliation, its economic subjugation, its territorial dismemberment, was a source of deep bewilderment, shame, and anger for many of its Muslim subjects. For the non-Muslim populations, it was a more complex picture. Some saw it as an opportunity to press for greater autonomy or even independence, while others feared that the weakening of central authority might lead to increased local persecution or intercommunal violence. A quirky or fringe tidbit: during these later centuries, various prophecies and apocalyptic visions circulated within the empire, predicting its imminent collapse or a coming age of chaos, reflecting the widespread anxiety and uncertainty of the times. It's like everyone suddenly starts believing those end-of-the-world sandwich board guys because, frankly, things are looking pretty grim all around. The sultans and their ministers were not entirely blind to these problems, of course. The 19th century in particular saw a series of ambitious reform efforts known as the Tanzimat, aimed at modernizing the Ottoman military, administration, legal system, and economy along Western European lines. New schools were established, new laws promulgated, new technologies introduced. There were genuine attempts to create a more efficient, more equitable, and more modern state, one that could hold its own against the rising power of Europe and secure the loyalty of its diverse populations. However, these reforms often faced stiff resistance from entrenched conservative interests from parts of the ulama, who feared westernization would undermine Islamic tradition, from the Janissaries before their eventual bloody suppression in 1826, who resisted any changes to their privileged status, from local notables who saw reforms as a threat to their own autonomy. Moreover, the reforms were often imposed from the top down, with little popular participation, and were frequently hampered by a lack of resources, administrative capacity, and the sheer scale of the empire's problems. Historians still debate the ultimate success or failure of the Tanzimat reforms. Were they a genuine, if flawed, attempt at modernization that ultimately came too little, too late, or were they primarily a cosmetic exercise designed to placate European powers while failing to address the fundamental structural weaknesses of the empire? For you, our long-suffering Ottoman subject, living through this era of decline and fitful reform, life was likely characterized by a pervasive sense of instability, uncertainty, and often a deepening hardship. The old certainties were crumbling, but the promised new order was slow to arrive, or arrived in forms that were disruptive and alienating. You might find yourself caught between the demands of traditional ways of life and the confusing, often contradictory, pressures of modernization. Your taxes might still be collected with brutal efficiency, but the services and security the state was supposed to provide in return were increasingly unreliable. The law might be reformed on paper, but corruption and arbitrary justice might still be your everyday reality. The empire might be losing wars and territories on its distant frontiers, but the consequences: increased conscription, higher taxes, economic disruption, a general sense of national malaise would be felt directly in your own village, your own workshop, your own home. It was a difficult, often bewildering time to be alive, a period when the grand, imposing edifice of the Ottoman Empire, which had stood for so many centuries, seemed to be slowly, inexorably crumbling into dust around you. And that, my friend, is a pretty good reason why your life, in this particular historical imagining, might have felt like it thoroughly sucked. And so, our long, often somber, exploration of why life could indeed suck in the Ottoman Empire draws to its close for tonight. We've journeyed from the absolute, often terrifying, whims of the Sultan, through the heart-wrenching dread of the Defsherm, the endless toil under a mountain of taxes, the gilded cage of the harem, with its dark secrets, the precarious existence of the dhimmi, the squalor and perils of city life, the labyrinthine and often unjust legal system, and finally, to the slow, crumbling decay of an empire in its twilight years. It has been a journey through power and powerlessness, through grandeur and misery, through systems designed for imperial glory, but often experienced as individual hardship. As these images of a bygone era, the bustling souks, the imposing mosques, the anxious faces of peasants and pashas, the silent suffering within palace walls, the dust of forgotten battlefields and crumbling frontiers begin to soften and recede into soften. And recede in your mind. Allow yourself to return gently to the present moment. Let the weight of this history, with all its complexities and its often harsh realities, settle lightly like ancient dust motes in a forgotten room, no longer needing your active attention. You have been a patient and thoughtful traveler through these often difficult landscapes of the past. You have borne witness to the struggles, the injustices, the everyday human experiences of those who lived within the vast and varied domains of the Ottoman sultans. Now feel the comfort of your own bed, the familiar textures of your pillows and blankets. Become aware of the quiet sounds of your own surroundings, the gentle rhythm of your own breathing. This is your sanctuary, your place of peace, far removed from the anxieties and uncertainties of those distant times. If any echoes of the stories we've shared still linger, imagine them as old, faded tapestries, their once vibrant colors now softened by time, their intricate patterns telling tales that no longer demand your immediate concern. They are part of the vast, rich, and often challenging story of humanity, a story from which we can learn, and then, when the time is right, peacefully disengage. Allow your body to become heavy, to sink deeper into the support beneath you. Let go of any tension you might be holding in your shoulders, in your jaw, in your hands. With each breath out, release a little more, letting the cares of the day and the weight of the centuries we have traversed Simply drift away. There is nothing you need to do now, nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to remember with any effort. Your only task is to allow yourself to be carried into the quietude of rest. Imagine yourself walking through a very old, very peaceful garden, perhaps one within the forgotten courtyard of a serene, ancient building. The air is cool and still, scented with the faint perfume of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. Moonlight filters through the leaves of ancient olive trees, casting soft, shifting patterns on the cobblestone paths. There is a gentle fountain murmuring in the center. Its waters are soothing. This garden is a place of profound tranquility, a space where time itself seems to slow down, where the clamor of the world, both past and present, cannot reach. As you stroll along these quiet paths, you feel a deep sense of calm pervading your being. Each step is lighter, each breath easier. The stories of the Ottoman Empire, with all their drama and difficulty, are now just distant echoes, like the sound of a far-off lute playing a very old, very sleepy melody. They are part of the rich, deep soil of history from which new understanding can grow, but they no longer require your active thought. You find a comfortable stone bench beneath a sprawling cypress tree, a place of deep shadow and comforting stillness. As you sit, you feel a gentle drowsiness beginning to envelop you, like the softest velvet cloak. Your eyelids feel heavy. Your thoughts become slow and indistinct, like ripples on a calm pond gradually smoothing out into perfect stillness. This is the natural welcome call to sleep, a gentle invitation to let go and to rest. There is nothing to resist, nothing to hold on to. Simply allow yourself to drift, to float, to be carried on this peaceful tide towards the shores of deep and dreamless slumber. The garden enfolds you in its ancient peace. The murmuring fountain lulls you with its timeless song. The soft moonlight guides you gently into the welcoming darkness of rest. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are at peace. And you are now ready, so very ready to sleep.